We got new Marvel Snap cards to talk about. The upcoming April season of cards has been data mined. We got big names like Baron Zemo and Red Hulk. We got some really cool and intricate designs with a lot to discuss. We got a couple really powerful cards, I think, in this video as well. So we're going to talk about all of these in great detail. I'm going to rank them all from best to worst, anticipating how good I think they'll be. But do keep in mind, these are data mined cards. These can change. They're absolutely not final. And we have been seeing more changes to the early data mines lately. So some of these numbers could definitely be tweaked before release, but we can still get a good idea on what the intention behind these cards are, and at least an early idea for how powerful they might be. So that said, let's kick things off here with our first card, Baron Zemo. And yeah, this card's both recognizable and has a lot to talk about. Like, we got a lot to talk about, to settle in for this Baron Zemo discussion. If you want to skip to other cards, there will be, the little chapters on YouTube down below. But we're gonna have a lot to say about this one. So Baron Zemo is a 4/6 on reveal. Add the lowest cost card from your opponent's deck here on your side. So basically, he's gonna grab a card out of their deck, not their hand, their deck specifically, and he's going to pull it up next to himself. So a lot of different angles to discuss the relevance on this card, but let's start with the most obvious, which is that Baron Zemo is a pretty solid body at a base at a 4/6, and because he's going to be adding a card next to himself, he's actually going to get a lot of bonus stat potential. And it's going to be the lowest cost card pulled from your opponent's deck. So sometimes that will just be like a 1-drop, and you might pull your opponent's Iceman or whatever. But keep in mind that even an Iceman pulled out of your opponent's deck would make Baron Zemo effectively a 4/8 in total stats, which is, not bad. It does occupy an extra spot, so there's some consideration there. But, even small cards too, like an Iceman or a Nebula or something, can have not only stats, but additional upsides as well, right? That can be that Iceman that disrupts something in hand. It can be a Nebula that your opponent now has to recognize, lest it scale and get bigger. And of course, it's not always going to be a 1-drop. Very often, depending especially on when you play this, your opponent may have filtered their deck down where they don't have anything small left. Like, they only run a couple 1-drops, a couple 2-drops. They just happen to hit those earlier in the game. Especially if you play this like on turn 6, there might only be a few cards left. There's a decent chance those few cards are like a 4-drop, a 5-drop, and a 6-drop. And Baron Zemo actually can rip a 4-drop out of your opponent's deck. And then suddenly he's pulling out, your opponent's Omega Red, let's say, since Omega Red just got buffed today. And you're getting like a 4/5 bonus that also has some kind of crazy upside effect as well, making Baron Zemo effectively a 4/11 in total stat output, because you just get all that for free as a bonus. And then I guess with Omega Red, it could potentially be even a 4/17 in output as well. Now that is like, the ideal sort of scenario, but clearly the stat output potential in Baron Zemo is really high. And I think if you get a 2-drop or a 3-drop even, this is going to be swinging way above its weight on average for total power output for 4 energy. And then of course you get Zabu in the mix as always with 4-drops, and this becomes even more efficient from a stat output sort of play. So right at that base level, right, this is just a good tempo play. Like, it's just stats, bodies on board, big numbers, and efficiency. Now there's a whole nother layer to this card beyond that, which is a sort of reconnaissance value. Because with Baron Zemo, you're going to learn quite a bit about your opponent's deck. So if you, for instance, grab any given card, they don't have access to that card. And sometimes you could pull like their combo piece, or, pull their Cerebro or whatever. And it's like, oh, okay, they don't have Cerebro. Their win condition's gone. Maybe the Cerebro's not super helpful to me, but I am now suddenly very favored in this game because I know they can't beat me with Cerebro. And of course, that might just force some concedes as well. Similar to the sort of thing you often see with Gladiator in that same kind of space. Baron Zemo, of course, versus Gladiator, you get to keep a card. That's awesome. But from a reconnaissance standpoint, you still get that sort of information. Now, on top of that, you also learn a little bit about the cards your opponent has already drawn. Because, for instance, if you get a 3-drop out of your opponent's deck, that is the lowest cost card in their deck, which means they have all their 2-drops in hand. And if you're wondering, like, oh man, can they curve together a Shang-Chi and a 2-drop on that final turn? Well, they have a 2-drop, so maybe you should expect a Shadow King and a Shang-Chi, or a Shang-Chi and a Maximus, or whatever, right? and suddenly you know that those 2-drops are in hand. And frankly, that could go even if you get like a 4-drop out of the deck, you know they have Cerebro in hand as another example, right? Oh, I got their 4-drop. They must have already drawn Cerebro. We have to account for Cerebro. So the fact that this is giving you that data could be a huge upside. Now, sometimes you won't learn much because you'll just get a 1-drop or whatever, and it won't tell you much. But other instances, you could actually learn quite a bit out of the Baron Zemo. Now, on top of that, the opponent also knows that you know, because they're also seeing the card, of course. They're going to be like, oh, yeah, okay, they pulled my Cerebro, right? We're going to retreat, whatever. Or they pulled a 4-drop, so they know I have Cerebro. Same sort of story. Both sides are gaining that information. So whether or not you can take advantage of that information may or may not be, you know, super relevant, especially with retreats possible. So like snapping pre-Baron Zemo could sometimes give you an upside or something. Now, a whole nother layer to this card, because we have to keep going. Like I said, there's a lot to discuss here, is the fact that Baron Zemo is actually going to make your opponent's deck better most of the time. Because he's pulling out the lowest cost card out of their deck, that is most often going to be the weakest card in their deck. And particularly as you get, you know, into the late stages of a game, most decks and players are looking to play big things. They want to play a 5-on-5. They want to play a 6-on-6. They want to have some big finisher combo piece sort of thing. They want to play Spectrum on 6, whatever it is, right? And you are increasing the odds of them drawing into that bigger thing by taking a smaller thing out of their deck. So suddenly, if you pull an Ant-Man out of their deck, they might draw a Spectrum instead of that Ant-Man. It's not necessarily a huge percentage change, but it is a percentage boost to that opponent's deck, kind of like the old school America Chavez, right? But in this case, Baron Zemo. I mean, I guess if they, you know, specifically need the lowest cost thing, like we said with Cerebro, you know, it can also help if you snatch it out directly, but very often you're going to be increasing the quality of their draws and increasing the curve of their draws at the very least. Which can be useful. Of course, you know, taking small things out can be lower quality if they need to weave in a 1-drop with a 5-drop or something. If they need an Ant-Man and a Valkyrie, suddenly you take the Ant-Man out. Obviously, that can be detrimental, but in many cases, they're just gonna be looking for the big thing, and you're actually making their deck stronger, their quality of draw stronger. So when it comes to Baron Zemo, basically you're balancing all of these sort of things, just raw, efficient number output, which I think this card is going to do basically all the time. Like, obviously there's some whiffs, but I think very often it's going to be 4-8, 4-9, 4-10 plus in average stats. You're also getting some informational upside, although one might argue that's symmetrical, but you're also improving the quality of your opponent's deck very often by giving them, again, higher curve draws on average. So it really just comes down to when is that worth it and how often is that going to help you. I think the stat efficiency and recon upside here is really significant. I think it's going to be a home run sometimes too, where you just, like we said, rip a 4-drop or something and it's completely amazing, especially if you play this on turn 6, say like a Zabu deck plays this and another 4-drop on turn 6. By the time you get down to turn 6, most decks only have a couple 1-drops, a couple 2-drops or whatever. Because, you know, if they're down to 3 cards in deck, there's actually a chance those are just 3 big things. If there's still 5 cards in deck, it's more likely one of those is small. So sometimes you'll just get lucky and rip something huge and just high roll like crazy with Baron Zemo, especially late in the game. So I think this card looks better than it looks weaker. There are downsides, of course. I think it overcomes those, though. I think there's going to be some big, surprising, and super fun plays. I didn't even talk about the crazy potential of like deck emptying strategies, which is probably more meme, but still something to keep an eye out on. We have like Gladiator, Yondu, Baron Zemo now that can all pull cards out of deck on curve. You might have some scenarios where the opponent's deck is just empty late in the game. So if you commit to this game plan, you also have, you know, like Baron Mordo you could weave in there. So that's actually a pretty cool curve. Yondu, Mordo, Gladiator, Zemo could really rip your opponent's deck to shreds. So there's going to be some fun to do with that. I doubt that's the best way to play this, though, just the fun way. So all in all, crazy cool card, really intricate design, surprisingly, but also I think a lot of potential. So moving on here, we have Red Hulk. Actually, 2 characters I recognize in 1 month, which is kind of crazy these days. I don't know most Marvel Snap characters that get released. But he is a 6/10 and reads, when your opponent ends a turn with unspent energy +4 power, if in hand or in play. So this is essentially the inverse of the high evolutionary Hulk the Evolved Hulk that gains +2 when you have unspent energy. This passes it over to your opponent instead and says, hey, I'm looking for you to float energy, and Red Hulk can actually scale faster. So it's nice that you don't have to skip energy yourself. You can play everything on curve and be happy and still get a really big Red Hulk if your opponent is floating a little bit of energy. So that's cool. You don't have to like build into this necessarily. Happily be super efficient all along the way. Still get a big payoff. But the downside is you can't control it, right? And there could be a ton of instances where this just ends up being a 610, which 610 is really not very rewarding in itself. I think you definitely want to get this to 614, 618 to feel worth it as one of those just big, dumb, single lane stat plays on turn 6. We know those can work with stuff like Blob, but they have to be sufficiently large to know that you can like single-handedly flip a location with that card. And even 14 is a little small for that these days. I think like 18, 22 range would be where you really feel better about this in that case. And the good news is, you know, a lot of decks do just kind of skip an early turn or two, like a turn 1 or a turn 2 can often be skipped because they don't hit a curve or they're just like more of a late game deck. So if Red Hulk is sitting in your opening hand, which will happen a third of the time, you have 4 cards on that turn 1, you know, if your opponent skips a couple turns, you could easily jump to 618 pretty quickly on Red Hulk and feel good about it. From there, it's a little more iffy. Now, there are ways to try to mess with your opponent's, you know, energy a little bit. You have like Iceman, kind of try to throw them off curve a little bit. There's like a, you know, Sandman, I guess you could play. It might be a little late, but might be hard for them to fill a turn exactly with a card like Sandman. Sometimes they don't have the right curve fits. So there are some disruptive things you could do to try to encourage a Red Hulk. I don't know if that's necessarily going to be worth it. And generally speaking, I don't know if this can be a general use card that you just put into decks. It may be too inconsistent, because if it's not in that opening hand, it's number one going to be way too small. That 12 power floor on the Hulk and the fact that you know you can control your Hulk's fate in a high Evo deck, that's pretty nice. Like, that gives you a little bit more information, a little bit more planning, and a little bit more just, you know, predictability in your deck in general. Whereas this, it feels iffier to me. Now, that said, this could still definitely be a card that gets played in things like, you know, Lockjaw decks, Hella decks. Those can be the same thing. But decks that are just running a big pile of giant stuff, and they don't necessarily have to play it or don't have to rely on it to be their big finisher piece, and it's just kind of a piece of, you know, 5 or 6 different big threats. Red Hulk might actually fit really nice there, you know. The fact that he's a 610 still feels good sometimes off the Lockjaw or the Hell or whatever, and then occasionally he high rolls into like a 22 that's nuts. There's also the world where you use this actually as a tech card against high Evo decks, which, you know, depending on the popularity of the meta, could be nice. I still don't know if he's worth it necessarily, but I do love the notion that your opponent is making this big Hulk, and every time they do, you're just making a bigger Red Hulk, and you're like, haha, you idiot. And I guess, you know, technically this could gain what, like 28 power on a Magic game if they floated energy 7 turns in a row. You'd gain 7 plus 4 is 28, would make him a 38 power card, which is kind of insane, but that's super unlikely. Though those instances where it's 20 plus, I'm sure will pop up here and there. So all in all, a card that I would say is like pretty situational, maybe meta dependent, and certainly in a specific niche of decks. I don't think this escapes that kind of big cheat style Lockjaw Hella stuff of big cards and finds general use case status. So solid playable card for sure, just not one I expect to see every day by any means. So moving on here, we've got White Widow, and this card looks nuts to me. This is a 2/2, and it reads, on reveal, add a -1 power Widow's Kiss to your opponent's side of here. So basically you get a 2/2 body, and you're also going to give your opponent immediately a -1 card, much like kind of Black Widow and the Widow's Bite. But importantly, this also has a bonus effect. Ongoing, your other cards here have -1 power, which is, you know, if they play 3 cards, they're up to a -3 power debuff. The Widow's Kiss herself is -1, that's -4, and the White Widow is 2 power. So in total, you're getting kind of potentially up to 6 power total net advantage here off the White Widow. And not to mention, you're also just, of course, clogging up one of your opponent's spaces, which we know for junk decks in particular can be nuts. And you can also send over like rocks and such with debris, so that, you know, those rocks are also getting a debuff from Widow's Kiss. You've also got potentially like high evo package with like Abomination that can benefit from those afflictions off the Widow's Kiss. But I think Junk is a more than suitable home for this card. Actually just looks kind of perfect in Junk decks. Does everything a Junk deck basically wants to do, and it does it super efficiently as well. It's just like cheap, kind of perfect line. So I like this card a lot. It's different than Black Widow because Black Widow also kills a draw from your opponent. You know, that is situationally very useful. This is more about that on-board impact and immediacy and that upside of the Widow's Kiss. Potentially paying off your other junk cards like the rocks and the hoods you send over, whatever it might be. So, I mean, this just looks like a pile of efficiency and annoyance, and it has a great fit in an already powerful and synergistic deck. You could do bounce stuff with this as well because it's so cheap, giving multiple Widow's Kisses to your opponent. I mean, this card just looks amazing. I see a lot of potential on this one, and perhaps a lot of frustration on this one as well. I don't have quite as much to say about this card other than it just looks very strong. So next up here we have US Agent, which is definitely different than Captain America and Patriots. They are definitely all unique characters and not just patriotic dudes holding shields. This is where the lore nerds come in and are like, actually, Regis, they're all very distinct and some are evil and such. And I'll be like, okay, yeah, that's cool. I actually do like hearing that stuff. I'm not being mean. It's always fun to learn the lore behind the characters. But US Agent here is a 2/6 with ongoing -1 power for each of your other cards here. So as you play stuff next to this guy, he gets smaller, kind of sort of like an inverse Captain America, which I'm sure is what they're hearkening to, but not exactly the same sort of impact. But basically a big dumb stat body here that gets, you know, smaller as you play stuff next to it. Now, a couple of use cases I think for this card. First and foremost, looks like a perfect fit in a Sauron deck where you're silencing off your ongoing abilities. We have Lizard in a very similar space in that deck as that oversized 2-drop basically, where you're removing the downside, just hoping to get there on raw stat efficiency. Now, Shuri Sauron lists, I mean, they still float around from time to time, but they're definitely not like top meta performers necessarily. I think they climb shockingly well, but you don't really see them played a ton. Is this enough to push a Shuri deck that extra next level? I don't think so. It's like a little better than Lizard. You could maybe run this as an extra card and lower the curve a little bit on the Shuri deck. There are some pretty spicy turn 6s you can make in that deck already. And this, like alongside a Lizard and an Ebony Maw, would be a shocking power dump if you did all that together. So you can imagine like a 6 energy turn that's like Agent, Lizard, Ebony Maw, and 0 and dump, what is that, 11, 18, 21 power? It's not bad at all if you wanted to kind of spread power wide in a deck that sometimes can go a little bit too tall and singular in its development in the late game. So maybe you shift the kind of shape or curve a little bit of that deck. Maybe this just adds an extra layer of redundancy, so you just have more payoffs for your Sauron basically. There's also a world, I think, where you use this card in plenty of other decks just as a big priority play early. We see that a lot already with cards like Maximus and Silk and Lizard, where you're just trying to get big 2-drops into play to give yourself some sort of priority advantage for whatever reason. Right now, it's for like Supergiant and Goliath and stuff. And I actually think this is a much better version of many of those, particularly if you look at like... you know, Maximus can be super risky giving your opponent multiple cards. Clearly, you don't want to give them extra stuff if you don't have to. This can just be a 2/6 for a long time until you decide to commit later once you've netted the priority advantage. If this loses a couple extra points and you play stuff next to it, maybe not the biggest loss. Still happy to have like a 2/4 or whatever. And it served its purpose to net that priority advantage over your opponent's, you know, smaller size 2-drop stuff. I would say in some ways even like Silk is a lot less predictable in that slot. Sometimes she bounces around and messes with priority a little bit. Lizard can be safe, but this also perhaps has less downside risk than Lizard late in the game. He can be a 2/1. You might, you know, depending on your plays, bottom out at like 2/4 on US Agent or something. Not to mention he starts higher as a 2/6. So I do actually think in just sort of tempo decks looking for priority for whatever reason, this becomes a really solid 2-drop option where you control the downside, you control the risk, and that's a much more reliable plan than some of the other alternatives. There's also perhaps a world for this card in that sort of like Atuma or Namor slot where you just happily keep him by himself and you like, you know, maybe play Mr. Fantastic or the new Omega Red or something, right? And it's just about adding a little bit of extra power. I don't think that makes much sense. He seems like he's too small to like carry a lane in combination with those other sort of small effects, but at least something to keep an eye on for US Agent. But definitely a Sauron home, and potentially just that 2-drop priority slot. He does look like a really good option. So moving on here, we've got Valentina. She is a 2/2, and much like her last 2/2, I think this one is insanely good. On reveal, add a random 6-cost card to your hand, give it -2 cost and -2 power. So you're making your 6-drop you get here randomly very cheap. It's going to cost 4, and it's only losing, I would say, comparatively a little bit of power. Obviously, we're talking about giant cards at the top end of the curve. Losing 2 power is nothing basically on an Infinite. He's still 18 power, but reducing his cost by 2 is incredibly significant. Now you've got a 4/18, and there will be plenty of times where you play Valentina on 2, you skip turn 3, and you play a 4/18 Infinite, and you're like over the moon that you just got this giant dude. But I mean, there's countless examples of where this actually the math just looks really good. Dr. Doom is a 4/3 that summons 2 5/5s. That's effectively a 4/13 total output, which great stats. Even stuff like I was thinking about, like, Odin or Heimdall. Odin's a Heimdall's a 4/7 with a nice high utility effect. That could really be surprising. Odin is a 4/6 with a huge effect. You could play it on Valentina and get another awesome on reveal. And then there's just stuff like, leaders and Alioths and stuff where you're like, okay, it's 0, but who cares? The effect is so powerful. I'm probably still going to be happy sometimes to play this at 4. Now, I mean, it's not all upside, right? There are obviously some cards that aren't as exciting and might be a little bit too situational. A 4/5 onslaught, like sometimes you might be pumped about that, but in a lot of decks it'd be like, okay, I don't really have any reason to play this random 4/5 or whatever. If you get a Hela and you don't have any discard, she's just like a 4/4 or whatever. I'm looking at like Galactus is a 4/3, like maybe, but it's pretty hard to win with a 4/3 Galactus. So there will definitely be some low roll games, but I don't think the 2/2 sacrifice here is so significant that you feel that bad about it, right? Like, you're losing a little bit of power efficiency, of course, or a 2-drop. You could get a 2/3, 2/4 with some sort of upside. But sometimes it's going to be like a game-winning sort of effect. And I think power spiking occasionally to, play for those giant surprises, play for those big cube swings is going to be worth the downside on this, because the downside's really not that bad. You'll still have a bad roll and win in a lot of scenarios. Not to mention if you're just benefiting from the fact that you're adding the card to hand via shield stuff like Collector, Devil Dinosaur, etc. She's going to feel fine anyway. She's going to feel like a complimentary piece. So I think the upside here is enormous. Going to high roll, going to spike wins like crazy. Downside's like, okay, whatever. I played a 2/2. We move on. We're fine. We still find ways to win. So for that reason, I think this card looks awesome. Has a lot of potential cube gains and some big plays. Looks very fun as well. I think I'm going to enjoy this one a lot. So our final card here is the Red Guardian, a new 3/4. On reveal, remove the text of the lowest power enemy card here. So take note, that's power, not cost. So you're going to have things with small power numbers, which sometimes this will just be a sort of Enchantress Light, where, you're happily going to remove the text from an Iron Man or a Cerebro or a Patriot or whatever, because a lot of low-powered, high-value cards are ongoing cards because they need some way to benefit the game while still having a low power value. So in many instances, ongoing cards are going to be the premium targets for this. Now, that said, there are certainly a handful of others. I ran through the list and looked at some of the most interesting. I think the 2 that jump out to me the most are Lockjaw. Very often, Lockjaw can be the lowest power card, is a 2-power card that's often pulling in bigger things. There may be some moments it pulls like an Infinity Stone or whatever, and you kind of get wrecked. Although, I mean, Soul Stone probably wouldn't be a terrible result for your Red Guardian. And then the other big target, I think, is Dracula in discard decks, actually. Dracula is a card that's really notoriously hard to answer in many cases, because his effect happens at end of game, so you can't like Shang-Chi it. It's hard to deal with. You've got like Lady Deathstrike that can kill it or whatever. But this would be a far more flexible way to deal with a Dracula, removing the text from the Dracula, basically just making it a 4/1, and it would very often be the lowest power card. Some other examples I saw included like Bishop that hasn't scaled yet, Collector that hasn't scaled yet, or by themselves, of course. It doesn't have to be the smallest if it's by itself. Whatever the card is the smallest by itself. And then I saw like Craven. I'm sure there are some other examples I missed, but a handful of things did make sense for this one. And then when you're talking about cards being alone, I do think there will still be instances that pop up where this works against like really big stuff or surprising targets that maybe don't have low power in particular. So like an example that came to mind was Null. Opponent plays a giant Null, and sometimes by itself because it's like going to carry a location or whatever. Red Guardian in a pinch can still hit that Null. It can be an Enchantress once again because ongoing cards are I think the most likely targets for these. But then I thought about stuff like Nimrod too. If your opponent plays a Nimrod out by itself with anticipation to eat it on a future turn, Red Guardian could hit the Nimrod and turn it off. Obviously, it might be Shuried first, and the Shuri will absorb the Red Guardian, sadly. But I did think, too, even with, like, on-reveal cards, something like White Tiger, if you're anticipating your opponent's going to, like, Odin a White Tiger, you could use Red Guardian to turn off the text on White Tiger and then stop the Odin from activating it again because it no longer has an on-reveal. So there is, like, weird little things that probably pop up for this card surprisingly often. So I do like the flexibility of this. Like, it can handle a lot of different things. Cards like Enchantress are better in some ways because they handle like the entire location, and you can silence both a Cerebro and a Mystique, that sort of thing. I don't know how this handles ties, but I think it might just pick one randomly. It's sort of like something like Rogue picks one randomly because it doesn't have like cards with a parentheses S or anything. So, Enchantress can be a little bit more universal, but is universal within a location, but is limited to ongoing effects. How often is Red Guardian going to be targeting ongoing effects? Is it 75% of the time? Is it 80% of the time? Because if it's 85% of the time, you might just be better off and happier running an Enchantress for the kind of, surefire hit on everything. If it's like 50% of the time, maybe Red Guardian has utility in it. It might just be meta dependent. If Dracula starts popping up a ton, if Lockjaw's everywhere, Red Guardian could make a lot more sense as a direct answer to those. He's not a huge sacrifice to play either. 3 costs is pretty flexible. You can weave it into turns fairly easily without sacrificing too much. Decent stat line on it too is a 3/4. So it's not like you're giving up a ton to run this. And if you have to just play a 3/4 sometimes, it's not going to feel like a disaster. And then the times it does hit, potentially a lot of cube equity there because you're going to be able to snap when you see Lockjaw, that sort of thing. So I don't know. It's a pretty interesting and flexible tech card of sorts that's not like, too restricted to a specific meta force, but at the same time will also whiff in a lot of scenarios. Because if your opponent's just playing big dumb stats, it's going to basically do nothing at all. So I don't know. This one, probably one of those just comes in and out of fashion as the meta demands it. So that said, we're going to go ahead and rank these cards. I don't do star ratings until we get the final versions of the cards in the final reveal, but we are going to rank these from best to worst. My number 1 card is White Widow. Number 2 is Baron Zemo. Number 3 is Valentina. Number 4 is Red Hulk. Number 5 is Red Guardian. And number 6 is US Agent. But I still think this card's okay. It's not like I think he's bad, just maybe the weakest of the bunch. Most specific, perhaps. Most niche. And there you go. That wraps it up for this look at the latest data mined cards. I think some really interesting stuff here. Very excited to see what Baron Zemo can do. I think both potentially a good card and a super fun card. Can't wait to make a 38 power Red Hulk somehow. That sounds insane. Did I really do that math right? 7 times 4 is 28 plus 10. Yeah, 38. That's nuts. That would be awesome to see. So it's really fun stuff. Curious to hear what you guys think about these cards. I'd miss any cool interactions or potential lines of play or decks you might be excited to try these in. Cool stuff you want to see and do. Always curious to hear that below. Which ones you most excited about? Share all those thoughts in the comments below. But until then, thank you much for watching, and until next time, game on.